Welcome back, everyone. We've had a great morning and we're looking forward to this afternoon's papers. Once again, we're going to try to be quite strict about time because we've fitted in a huge number of presentations today and we have a performance to go down to at the end. So I think, again, if we run into coffee time, then we'll have a shorter coffee time. And today we've presented with people giving their papers and then taking some questions and then having questions again at the end. So we can maybe follow that if there are immediate questions. And when Sarah finishes, we'll take maybe one or two questions and then we'll change presenters at the end. We'll maybe ask all the presenters to be available for broader questions that may occur to people as the presentations go on. So I'm very pleased to introduce Sarah O'Toole of Galway as the first of our speakers in this session, which is the panel on the interplay of politics, protest and community. And Sarah is going to speak on the Ladies' Day Suffragette paper, Feminist Strategies from Media Decolonisation to Performing the Irresistible Image. Thank you very much, Sarah. Once everyone's seated, maybe
Hi everyone. I wouldn't have time to cover every point raised in the abstract, so I've kind of, in the summary, I've kind of laid out what I am reading. I'm writing paper, I realize there's just so much more to look at in this, which I'm not going to leave it down. In July of this year, myself and two fellow activists decided to attend Ladies' Day at the Galway races. We dressed in Edwardian costume and wore homemade traditional style suffragette sashes, trimmed in purple and green ribbon, and emblazoned with the slogans, "What century are we in?" "Choice for women," and "Repeal the Ache." While there wasn't a huge amount of reaction at the actual event itself to this performative protest on Irish women's abortion rights, which we had dubbed the Ladies' Day Suffragette paper, this was something we had anticipated, so we documented the protest through the online sharing of images of our physical presence there. However, the strength of the online reaction afterwards was so positive, and the reach of this imagery produced was so far beyond our expectations, that I decided the performance was worthy of further analysis in order to bear fruit for further strategies for feminist activism. Therefore, I'm delighted to be presenting this practices research paper today at this particular symposium, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other papers, which I know will provide me with further food for thought on this topic. So, you've probably seen the image I've handed around already, and if you haven't, take a quick look. I'll be talking about it throughout the talk anyway. So, in a recent interview with Michael Shane Boyle in Contemporary Theatre Review, performance theorist and activist L.M. Bogad describes an irresistible image as an image artists and activists can create in public confrontation. It's an image that's so compelling, so strange or surprising, or just so succinctly sharp in its analysis of the situation that even your ideological opponents will reproduce it. And ideally, it's an image that tells your story while jamming up the signal of what Bogad calls the hegemonic monologue of corporate or state media. In his book, The Media Ecosystem, self-described media ecologist Antonio Lopez explores the potential for a more sustained jamming of this signal under the term media decolonisation. And I'll just have time to touch on that aspect today, but it's something I'd like to look at further. So today I will be engaging with these ideas from Bogad and Lopez in order to analyse how this performance as an irresistible image jams the hegemonologue in the act of staging a feminist protest on an occasion which is traditionally associated with patriarchal notions of beauty and appearance, and to assess its success in decolonising media coverage around this annual event. For those of you who are not from Ireland, it's probably useful to provide some context around the Galway races and Ladies' Day. It is the race's reputation as a focal point for the worst excesses of the Celtic Tiger that lends it its infamy. Tales of politicians in champagne tents and helicopters rankle in the ears of all of us who are now paying for their profligacy through austerity. There's a certain level of resentment towards what is seen as the vulgarity of these nouveau riche who can still afford to cram themselves into that champagne tent and compete wearing ostentatious hats and expensive, brightly coloured couture for the annual best-dressed lady prize. None of them are even interested in horse racing, many complain. So the deterioration of this immaculate appearance following the excessive drunkenness that starts at the racecourse and that descends upon the streets of Galway afterwards leads many locals to view the title Ladies' Day with not a little irony. I suppose I'd better make my subject position as a left-wing feminist clear from the start, that I'd always counted it a point of pride that I'd lived in Galway for all my life and never once gone to the Galway races. The recurrence of an annual event like this in the mainstream social calendar is a prime example of what Marxist theorist and French situationist Guy Debord termed spectacular or frozen time, where our capitalist epoch, which presents its time to itself as essentially made up of many frequently recurring festivities, is actually an epoch without a festival. Mass pseudo-festivals, with their travesty of dialogue and their parody of the gift, may incite people to excessive spending, but they produce only a disillusion. These continual festivities distract the individual from the fact that they are alienated from living in historical time. In other words, they are not part of the forward movement of history, but are trapped in a cyclical calendar of consumption, analogous to, but not the same as, the prehistorical cyclical calendar of agriculture. As Debord says, the spectacle proclaims predominance of appearances and asserts that all human life, which is to say all social life, is mere appearance. To highlight the feminist perspective through which the problems of patriarchy nearly always lead back to capitalism, this reaches its apex on Ladies' Day, where the racecourse, the town, and the media become arenas for a gaudy hyper-performance of commodified femininity, and much conversation, both appraising and derogatory, is focused on their beauty and appearance. These ostensible celebrations of Irish womanhood serve to distract women from the real issues facing them today, keeping the focus on both capitalist commodity and patriarchal notions of femininity, and cutting them off from being part of any real forward movement of their own history. So we decided that, given its title, Ladies' Day was an excellent day to open a conversation about ladies in Ireland in 2015. And of course, the prime topic was always going to be our draconian abortion laws, which have negative implications for our equality as citizens. Furthermore, the Galway race's long-standing affiliation with government politicians made it the perfect place to bring the protest. For, in spite of infamous cases such as the death of Savita Halappanavar in 2013 and the X case in 1992, our government is continuing to resist pressure not only from feminist groups in Ireland, but from the European Court of Human Rights to repeal the 8th Amendment to our Constitution and bring our abortion law in line with international standards. This subsection after Section 3 of Article 40 in our Constitution essentially equates the right to life of a pregnant woman with that of an embryo or a fetus, and in doing so criminalises abortion in all cases, except where to continue a pregnancy would result in death. This is giving women's bodies the status of mere vessels under Irish law. So, given this context, to what extent did we succeed in creating an irresistible image? Let's break down Bogad's definition, which I provided in my opening, and which you can also see in your handout. Going back to Guy Debord, the image was strange and surprising in the sense that it was a situationist-style détournement, or turning around, of an intrinsically significant element which derives a different scope from the new context. In this case, classic Ladies' Day racing fashion. Interestingly, as we built the event up online and posted our elegant Edwardian costumes before we put on the sashes, people mistook it as a mischievous social commentary and applauded us for going to the races dressed as real ladies. While the phenomenon of this highly traditional performance of femininity suddenly becoming radical in a space like this is ripe for further exploration in another paper on gender performativity, it is worth saying for now that while we were more interested in the historical properties of the costume than in fashion-shaming our fellow female attendees, we actually cropped out a girl in a really skimpy dress out of one of the images so as not to exploit that contrast. The ladylike demeanour did seem to have an impact on how the performance was received. This non-threatening presentation, along with the humorous irony, disabled the common stereotype of what a feminist protester should look like, or how they should behave, while the DIY quality of our homemade and vintage store outfits provided an alternative to this vision of hyper-commodified femininity I mentioned earlier, creating an entry point to the image for some people who might otherwise have passed it over. As an image created by artists and activists in public confrontation, it was activist in nature, but it employed theatrical methodology in order to analyse the situation and communicate within it. The overall concept, supported by location, timing, costume, text, performance style, and very ladylike. So it was heavily influenced by Bertolt Brecht's theory of the gestus, in that it was a figurative aesthetic grouping in a particular space which allowed conclusions to be drawn about the social circumstances. For example, the wearing of historical dress alongside the slogan, "What century are we living in?" dramatises the relative lack of movement on women's rights in Ireland by calling attention to how much time had passed since the birth of feminist action. The suffragette's body's presence in a racecourse is a physical memory of the urgency and unpredictability of activists in this spectacular space in the past, recalling specifically the incident where a suffragette, Sylvia Davison, was killed at Epsom in 1913 after running out in front of the King's horse. It also recalled Savita Halappanavar by posing the question of how many more women have to die before we are granted equal status as citizens. However, when it comes to decolonising media for protest performance in the public and virtual space, thinking of it as mere gestus is insufficient, as according to Bogad, to receive a Brechtian gestus, you are already in that wonderful controlled environment of the theatre, where everything has been deliberately worked out. You're not incorporating your actual opponents into the gestus. In that sense, our image falls slightly short, in that although we are in an oppositional space, there are no government politicians or pro-life campaigners in the actual picture. And indeed, I will talk more about the surprising lack of reaction at the event itself later on. The image does continue to fulfill Bogad's definition in that it is a succinctly sharp analysis of the situation, in the sense that it is created as a palimpsest, a useful way of exploring the Debordian frozen time I mentioned earlier, and bringing an awareness of historical time and the urgent need for its forward movement back into the spectacular space. M. Jackie Alexander describes the palimpsest as follows. It is a parchment that has been inscribed 2 or 3 times, the previous text having been imperfectly arranged and remaining therefore still partly visible. The idea of the new, structured through the old, scrambled palimpsestic character of time, thus re-scrambles the here and now, and the then and there, to a here and there, and a then and now, and makes possible the ideological traffic between and among formations that are otherwise positioned as dissimilar. Thus, in the sense that it is an image that tells a story, it sweeps a multiplicity of stories and cultural allusions into its narrative through this aspect of its conceptualization. Think My Fair Lady or the Lovely Girls competition in Father Ted, for instance. Comic book analyst Scott McLeod, in his book Understanding Comics, provides a useful term for how this story is told. Closure is a rule governing the use of comic language, which is the process of observing parts but perceiving the whole. This means that the full impact of the performance hits not on the racecourse, but on the surface of, not on the surface of the image itself, but in the minds of the audience as they perceive the image, and a cluster of other images and meta-narratives come together, allowing for their active participation in its creation and a pleasurable aha moment. It is all these factors leading up to that precious aha moment that make people want to share an image online, to the extent that it can undermine the overall corporate capitalist hegemony of an event for its own agenda. I am now going to analyse our success in achieving this, while continuing to break down Bogad's definition, and then to open it out to the wider demands of its wider context with reference to the work of Antonio Lopez. As I mentioned earlier, once we entered the space of the racecourse, nothing much happened. To be completely honest, part of me had been hoping we would be thrown out, as that would have been something we could really document. Can you imagine the caption? Thrown out of Ladies' Day for being too ladylike. But we satisfied ourselves with taking a few photos, tweeting, Facebooking and Instagramming them, and then roaming about the racecourse with our parasols and drinking wine out of china teacups. We got talking to a few people who asked us what it was about. Some immediately froze up when we told them, some were very supportive, but many of them did not even know what repeal the 8th meant. After a relatively enjoyable few hours, we left, with a sense of satisfaction from having had our say and done it, and hoped at least our friends online had gotten some satisfaction out of it and shared it a bit. However, once we got home, we were delighted to find that people had enjoyed and shared the images so much that one of them had been picked up by the underground newspaper Rabble and had gone completely viral. By the end of the day, there were thousands of views, hundreds of shares, tens of positive comments, and also a few negative. Encouraged by this, we decided to tweet it to the major news outlets, both local and national. It was enthusiastically picked up by the Journal, who dubbed it Picture of the Day, and wrote an article about us going back in time to talk about the present. And this also went viral with over 40,000 views and a healthy 180 comment-strong debate below it. The following day, another article was written by the blog Today in Cats, where the author described what we had achieved as media decolonisation. He defined it as where three women with an idea can flip the script and educate and engage people at a mass level without anyone's permission. He also quoted a rather hilarious conversation that had been found online beneath the image, where a woman who had seriously disapproved of us had shared it, and which, among other things, described us as out-acting the lady but hiding black hearts and looking like we would haunt houses. This hits on two key aspects of Bogad's definition. To a certain extent, the image was irresistible enough for our ideological opponents to reproduce it, but not as much as we would have liked. Perhaps some pro-life people mistook it as a comment on ladylike behaviour and shared it. I couldn't find that out. Perhaps this may go back to the fact that we hadn't fully incorporated our opponents into the image, so that they wouldn't have attempted to use it for their own purposes, even mistakenly. There certainly was a jamming of the hegemonologue, in that thankfully some people were no longer talking about ladies' appearances. Comments showed that it tapped into an abiding hatred people have of the races, as much as their feelings on the abortion issue. And again, I think this provided us an entry point which allowed us to speak to people who might otherwise have switched off from us. The lively comment section in the Journal showed that it didn't entirely happen within a liberal echo chamber either, but many of the larger media outlets that we tweeted the image to chose not to pick it up, most significantly the local paper, the Galway Advertising. So the success of the Irresistible image was partial, in that it was distributed by independent media and then by people themselves on social networks. It didn't manage to break through to being covered by the larger media cartels, as have performance protests by fellow abortion activists, speaking of Imelda. And our next step is to figure out how to do that. However, we noticed Imelda don't get a high degree of shares apart from the Andy Kenny incident, so it's worth looking at both to see how we can improve what we do. However, Antonio Lopez articulates the difficulties in wider media decolonisation when he talks about the bind between using the internet to organise against capitalism and yet at the same time having our actions limited and our interests and relationships commodified by large for-profit corporations. It would be interesting to see how our image would have operated had it been represented by the Galway Advertiser or the Irish Times. Would it have been possible for them to recuperate it to serve a hegemonic agenda? Lopez's idea of the internet as something that can be hacked into to reclaim it for our cultural commons describes a more sustained project than Bogan's monologic, great word, signal jamming. While this is a massive undertaking, I do think performance activism has a powerful role in this, and I fully intend to organise and participate in more examples of this kind of what my dad terms as cultural terrorism until we see the 8th repealed. I would have loved to have had time today to talk about other performance activists in relation to this and discuss methods for a sustained onslaught within this, what Lopez describes as a media ecosystem, but I hope this paper has at least provided some ideas through its analysis of an attempt to create an irresistible image, just how we can begin as performers, activists and academics to use performance and the internet to break through this Dewardian society of the spectacle and remind people that they're relinquishing the opportunity for genuine festival in their lives, that of participating in their own history.
Sarah? Yes?
I'm interested to know at what age you radically became a cultural terrorist. And then I will ask another question.
Actually, my cousin Emer O'Toole writes about it in this book, and she says this one of the things. She says, Bell Hooks says feminists are made, not born, but then she had never met Sarah O'Toole, and she provides examples of me from early childhood refusing to participate in.
So, my second question is: did your school or schooling affect what you did to produce this? in a positive way and negative way. And I'm asking this for a very personal reason because I'm working on school.
I think in a resistant way.
Yeah.
It's a very, our school, they're very conservative. The girls in my school are very conservative as well. There are only 16 of us in the year. And I did campaign that girls could wear trousers instead of skirts for their uniforms. So probably in a very resistant way. Although I went to a very progressive primary school. But feminist things didn't really come up. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was really interesting. Thank you.
I hope we didn't read too fast.
Yeah, no, it was great. I mean, the protest was really interesting, and then to hear you talk about it was really interesting. And I suppose I'm just kind of thinking about the stuff on what you're saying about projecting a respectable image with a not respectable message. You know, to a very big inverted commas in both of those. And in one way, that's very powerful because it's kind of disarming people because of your appearance. And then on the other hand, I wonder, what does that say about those of us who don't look so respectable with those unrespectable images? Do you know? And in one way, it's a very powerful political strategy. And then on another hand, it's, do you know, do we all have to conform to a certain amount of respectability to get unrespectable messages across? I'm not saying that very well, but I don't know if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's like that came up for me a lot when I was writing about it, and we really resisted talking about like slagging off how women look on Ladies' Day because we were trying to take it away from that.
Yeah.
But also, I think there's room for both. I think it's just a different strategy, and I think if you want to maybe reach a certain group of people, that if you know who you want to disarm, use it.
Yeah.
You know, but because we were, it was respectable, but it was referencing bad behaviour in the past too. But it's just a really weird kind of point of reference for lots of different things. But I mean, look at the slut walks. You know, I think that's a really, really powerful tool as well. That you know, they're not in opposition to each other. I think they're going to galvanise different people. And I think about, you know, to have as many strategies as possible to sort of disarm people or to grab people is a good idea.
Actually, I think even the issues of what is respectable, what's bad behaviour and so on, raise so many issues. There was just one more maybe, and then.
Yeah, I know, I'm really interested in that because there's quite a long history of performance artists in particular. I know this isn't just performance artists, it's about activism as well, but conventionally attractive women and men, when it's relatively easy for them to kind of go into the stereotype of what's attractive for that sex or gender or whatever, they've often had criticism about that, particularly women. I'm thinking of Abramovich and some American performance artists. But it reminds me, being also a woman who can conventionally fit into what's attractive and how that's, as a performer in the past, how I've often found that quite challenging, but also powerful, you know, as a tool to use. And sometimes it's about what can you use, and if that's available, maybe that's okay. I remember once in 2004, I was doing a series of performances in different sites in Cork City, and it was in Blarney Woolen Mills, and they were in a costume that a community of knitters that I was working with would knit. We would knit different ones each month. And this month I'd been away, so I hadn't seen what it was. And when I saw it, it was this incredibly skimpy cream tube that was all like open at the side. And I looked at it and I said, I can't wear that. I can't. And then the knitters were really upset. So I wore the dress and I did the performance in the knits with a community of knitters. But what I did is I ended up performing in the Blarney Woolen Mills in the shop, and I went through the whole history of textile workers and their exploitation is a very powerful one. And at that time, 10 years ago, more than that now, all of the jumpers had the name of the woman who knitted it. So I went around, there was a lot of kids and young people and teenagers, and we started shouting, after I'd done my dancey bit, we went around and we started getting these jumpers out and calling out the names, and all the children and lots of teenagers did that. So it felt like I found a way, and I would work with improvisation quite a lot to kind of disrupt what I was very aware was a kind of conventionally kind of attractive thing. I don't know if that's useful, but it resonates a bit to what you're doing, not entirely, I know.
I think I'll just add to that very briefly in that I wouldn't call what we chose to wear attractive because it was from another time. It was sort of asexualized.
But it looks fun to wear, and I think that's important
but
too.
I think in that, as opposed to the costumes that of the time at the races that were, you know, vying winning of Sexual Attractiveness Awards. Ours, because it was a costume that it was sort of taken out of that sexualized discourse of patriarchy to that extent, even though it looked pretty. And that was my reading of it as well. So yeah, but it is interesting to play with the conventional.
We might have to conclude there for the moment, and I'll thank you very much indeed, Sarah. I'll call next on Jenny to get set up, and maybe while Jenny is getting set up, I'll just say that with regard to the 8th Amendment, which is about getting abortion out of the Constitution, there is a repeal conference in Dublin on the 12th of September, and on the 26th, Saturday the 26th, there is a demonstration in March. There's an annual march, and in the past, I suppose 3 or 4 years, that march has been much, much larger than it would have been in the past, and we hope to have a bus going up from Cork and welcome as many people as would like to be involved in that, travelling up to the march. So, sorry, I'm now having taken the opportunity as the chair to say that, and introduce Jenny, who's from UCC, and who's going to talk about from ancient grudge, rape to mutiny, using the digital archive to inform contemporary practice.
Okay, so this has been a really engaging day for me so far. So there's an awful lot of what I'm talking about in my paper, which hopefully will resonate with what has been said already, I hope anyway. I'm coming from the Department of Drama and Theatre Studies, and I'm going into my second year of my PhD, fingers crossed, and my practice is playwriting and creative writing, essentially. And I also work in applied drama, so I work with youth, community, education, all that kind of thing. And I suppose every day, I ask myself, what does that mean? What does it mean? What's my job? What's my purpose? What's my function? And how do I fit into contemporary society? What does that mean to me in terms of the greater discussion, in terms of the creative culture that we're making and doing, and also in terms of what's happening all the time in terms of technology and people in and out of that. So I suppose I'm always looking at what I can contribute to humanity, I suppose. And at the core of my practice, I focus on two things. I focus on what I call, I suppose, storytelling, and what I call, and other people call these things too, but these kind of words I use, I call it kind of performance or emotional architecture. So basically, that's kind of how I work. And I look at those things in a very kind of a way of creating something that can contain the contradictions that are going on all the time, or that I feel, or that are kind of channeling through me as a practitioner. And I believe in story powerfully. I believe it's the breadth of our playwriting experience. And I believe that there's a compulsion to tell a story. I think we feel that. We feel the compulsion to tell stories as writers, as people, as socially engaged, academics. And regardless of how that story is shaped, how we decide ourselves to structure it, what style we decide to present it in, what the tone of it is, how it becomes a story is a process of telling that. And sometimes that process can take quite some time. So just to kind of hark back onto what Becky was saying before lunch about sustaining the energy of the activist or the artist activist, is that how do you create spaces in your life where you can do your work, So that's why I'm doing the practice-based or practice-led even PhD. There's obviously, as we all know, I don't need to go into this, there's different story patterns. Advertisement has totally nailed it on the head, and it's dangerous. It's really, really powerful. But I guess as well that there's a lot of other kinds of patterns, which I would call kind of, asleep, dormant, a deep sleep of a kind of a collective subconscious. There's memories of stories of that were in our consciousness, but we've forgotten what they were. So I think as a playwright, one of my functions is to kind of, like an archaeologist would, dig up those patterns almost, and find what it is about those patterns that are very familiar to us, that we recognize about ourselves, and then also to kind of sort of just smash them apart and, you know, make them really kind of play with them and see what is also what they can be used to do to tell us about who we are today. So that's kind of basically that's what I do. And I think it's this guy I met, his name is Darren. He was in a playwriting workshop that I did, just so in case you see him on the stage there, that's his face. He put it really well, I think. He said you got to dig down deep as far as you can go, and the whole of it will open up inside of you. And it's kind of that whole idea of you look into the void, and eventually that void will start to talk out through you. All of it will come through you if you're willing to take on the risk of the contradictions. And I think that's a really important thing, that sometimes it's not very easy what comes back. So you have to be prepared to kind of take on that risk in your personal life, and that's tough. So I suppose just to tell you a little bit about the story that I'm talking about in my PhD, it's an adaptation of Peter Waller's original manuscript, which his brother John used as a basis to write the novel Irish Flame. The story is about a young boy who witnesses the arrival of the Black and Tans to Ireland and the events leading up to the Irish War of Independence. In the play adaptation I'm working on, there are 7 characters who inhabit this world, which is 1920s Ireland essentially. So one of the first things I did was I had to look at this time and try and kind of get a sense of kind of what way were people talking, what way were people communicating, what way were people thinking about in that. What was the world like? What was the consciousness of that time? How do I tap into that? What was the social, political, kind of the psyche, the pulse that was kind of going on around those times, essentially, leading up to the Civil War. But also being committed to the a more kind of putting things into a contemporary kind of context. I have to also ask myself, what's happening today? Kind of what's the current state of our humanity at the moment? And, what does that mean to us, essentially? And in the future, what is that going to mean to us as well? How has it changed? Has anything really changed, have things lessened in value? And what are those? What are those little chinks that you can play around with? And those kind of questions circulate in my mind. And they start to knit, and the story, the context, and the questions. And after a bit of mulling, it's kind of how I decide to plan things out. And with this particular project, I kind of decided to focus on the voices of conflict. So this idea of voices, the different voices, and many of them, which is something that I'm working on actively at the moment. But in particular, it's the voices of women in conflict, because, and I'll go on to this a little bit why, but that's just kind of where it's all fallen. Now, I'm going to put all these stories on a stage in the form of a play, and I have to look at how I want to do that. I want to look at how the audience is going to read it as a piece of performance. So in what ways am I going to set up the triggers that I want in the audience's mind so that they go away with a lot of questions, a lot of things simpering and thinking about. And that's when I start to really think about my research as a playwright and my playwriting research. And for the project I'm referring to now, I used a few sources. The original manuscript, the book adaptation, conversations with the writer himself, his family, my family and friends, grandparents of people I know who've kind of had that oral history still, and just kind of gathering up a kind of a sense of what's going on about what is humanity and what was humanity, what are we doing, basically. And another source I used, which I hadn't used ever before, was I began to look at the digital archive, which was a new source for me. And I learned a lot about the representation of the female voice on stage by doing this. There's heaps there I'm not going to go into, but it's a really interesting study. But what I want to concentrate on today is I want to concentrate on the Abbey Archive and its 1903 production of Kathleen Hourigan, because of basically how it relates to what I'm doing in my own practice. Now, it's not really my area of research, but what I did come across is that there's inconsistencies in the fact that Yeats is said to write this, and it's also argued that Lady Gregory wrote the play, and she has her own manuscripts with pens saying, I wrote this, I wrote this, I wrote this. I'm sure most of us in the room are aware of that. But this is a remarkable fact. I mean, the fact that, you know, if it was a guy, or man even, excuse me, that, you know, it doesn't even kind of come into your thought, but that when I brought this up with Galway at the Performing the Archive, you know, a few people came up to me afterwards and were like, questioning it, you know. But I wonder if it was the other way around, would I've had that kind of barrage, you know, and that's interesting. So it's been revered for its political consciousness. It has been said to re-establish Yeats's national credentials and put him at the helm to create a new theatre for the Irish people. It was probably written by Lady Gregory. It's possible to think that this kind of issue would easily be resolved if you were to consult the archives, but it's just not there. There's nothing there in the archives to kind of really point you or give you any form of clarification on these things. And then there's other things like you see in the media and when you research. For instance, there's a couple of TV programs based on 1916 and a 2015 RT event, and it basically placed Lady Gregory as the writer. But what this tells me that is, as a playwright, there's a lot the archives don't say, and it's the job of the contemporary theatre maker to go digging into them. And there's a wealth of invisible characters, silenced voices that we need to shine a light on, illuminate and crank up the volume. So that's basically Lady Gregory. So just very briefly on Kathleen, it's a short play, about 20 minutes. It's set in a peasant's cabin in the west of Ireland. It's set around the time of the landing of the French, around 1798 into Ireland. And the mother and the father, their eldest son is getting married the next morning, and they're really, really excited because they're going to get £100 dowry from the marriage, and it's all just absolutely amazing. Next thing, this old woman shows up, starts kind of bemoaning to them about, in their mind, about her 4 green fields, which represent the 4 provinces of Ireland. She walks out the door, and then when their son comes back, the whole thing is that, you know, Michael, did you see an old lady walking down the road? And he said, no, I didn't. Oh, sorry, the son follows her and doesn't go and get married. And then when he comes back in, no, I didn't, but I saw a young woman who should have walked the queen. So that's the whole kind of thing, is that, you know, the forever youth of the country is bound up in this, you know, political action and nationalism and all these ideas, which I'm quite tippy about anyway. So this story, though, is an old story. It's not. It's an old story that Yeats used, but what he did differently was that he set it in a political context, which hadn't been done before. Usually it's set off in a mythical world of Tiernan, which is somewhere out there by America. But that's what he did. But Maud Gonne actually played the role of Kathleen O'Houlihan, and I think it's really interesting that this is what I want to get at, is her part in that performance, and what I think could have had a lot to do with this. She came over to Ireland and she wanted to get actively involved in the cause. And she went up to the Fenian leader, John O'Leary, which I thought was quite forward of her. You know, I've heard so much about you. You're the leader of the revolution in Ireland. I want to work for Ireland. I want you to show me how. And then he said, you know, you must read the history of our country, read literature, I'll lend you books, and then you must lecture. So that's how you do it. But she went on stage anyway, and she delivered this, what has been described as basically this looking offness, apparently. It was a very kind of like almost beyond the real of the stage into a different time, and it really resonated with the audience, and it was a very kind of a haunting look, and it was this whole idea of this kind of what has been criticised, kind of this idea of imaginative politics, and that kind of was the whole kind of catalyst to a lot of what the intelligentsia had been kind of discussing, and you know, the whole movement came from this really artistic, imaginative kind of thinking about what nationalism could be, which I think is problematic, and probably would have been better off thinking about humanity rather than nationalism. So this kind of alienation effect essentially is kind of was this kind of what I think, you know, with the whole Ladies' Day thing, it's the same thing, you know, taking something and putting it into that sort of jarringness. That was a really kind of an important thing. Now, obviously Breck didn't document this till much later, but I'm actually retrospectively looking at these things, and in my own way putting these labels onto things for my own understanding. So what I think that whole kind of transformative element of what the play did was that it kind of took the romantic kind of mythical idea and it placed it in a real sort of everyday political kind of context that people were, kind of jolted essentially. And also then, just to go back to that idea of what was mentioned, the guestess, that attitude that Morgan would have got from her learning and her knowledge and her education and her perception would have come from that, and she actually put that into her physical gesture of the way that she performed the role. So the reason why I'm talking about this is that they kind of relate an awful lot to the way I'm setting up the images in my own play. And so these kind of looking at how performances in the past related to these themes of conflict and voice and equality and oppression, all those, and kind of looking at how I can read between, looking at exposing what's missing, and really kind of sort of using that as a way to enrich my own process of writing for the stage. So that's kind of it in terms of my using that. So just to go on, how I work, I get a play and I get an idea for a play. Sometimes it's a case where I can hear a voice. I remember Frank McGuinness was talking about that, like he's like, the voices never leave me alone, they just come into your head and that's that. And sometimes it can be an image or a source. This particular one came to me through somebody else, but I was really engaged by the stories anyway. I usually get actors together, I have a couple of scenes written, I develop it with them, and then after that I basically kind of just, I write as I make, and I make what I write. And when the making part of the day is done, there's usually a discussion, and I listen and I return, and if I feel there's things I feel I need to write a little bit more into that scene, or I'll go away and I'll think about it and come back again and try again, but it's the discussion, and it's the, for me, I need that as a practitioner, that constant kind of feeding the work as it's being developed, and that's really, really important for me. And I think the theory that I would say is that I use as a collective consciousness of the actors to study the characters in action over time. So that's kind of what I feel I'm doing. And I mean those characters in that sense that each character, and this is, Brett's thinking as well, that it's each one of them is their own little story in themselves, their own play in themselves, that they are all part of the bigger, but those stories are very, very precious and contained, and really as little playlets in themselves too. So, so this is kind of how I work, and then that working. What I'm trying to do now is look at that in terms of my research as a practitioner. Research is that what I want to do is like, so say for instance when the actors are presenting work to me before I go and write it, what I'm doing sometimes is I'm reading them. So there's a literacy there, performative literacy. And I'm not reading them in the way that you would if you're a behavioural psychologist. I'm reading the meaning that they're making. So it's like if you're reading an essay and people have things spelled wrong, you can still get the message of what they're trying to communicate with you. And sometimes the actors might not necessarily really, really be exactly where I know they want to be, but I can read where they're trying to get to. Do you know what I mean? So I think that comes as a skill. I do think that's a skill you have to develop as an artist, like you would if you were a painter, you'd develop those skills. And I think that literacy comes with doing a lot of that kind of work, a lot of improvisation and things like that. And also, I think playwrights in particular do this very well because they're looking at people in that way all the time in their everyday lives as well, and trying to sense what's really happening, what's the true meaning of what's happening as well. So it's the people together interacting and that meaning being created rather than analysing the individual person, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense? So that's kind of my way of working anyway, and what I would see myself doing is, my theory is I facilitate a space where actors take on characters and present a study of their behaviour before and after an event, and I read essentially what the meaning of that is, what that means. And in the case of the play I'm developing at the moment, the event is historical, the arrival of the Black and Tans. And what of the behaviour? There's a question of the character, what they would do. So obviously you have to kind of go back into the past and think about, how will people act in that particular way. But you also have to be thinking, what do people do nowadays? Because you have to contextualize it in your own understanding of things. And because you're forever trying to think about the greater picture, you're thinking, what would somebody do if circumstances were different? And this way of thinking, this kind of multi-layered of questioning about then, now, future, it keeps things really unjudgmental, and it keeps the play very open, and it keeps everything in a very kind of a Socratic kind of a way, that there's questions. It's all just about posing the questions. You're not trying to solve any of the problems. You're not doing a big reveal. You just want to energize a discussion and have it very exciting to be part of. And of course these questions are driven by a singular dramatic question that you have. And in my play, the dramatic question is what happens when war arrives on your door. So as I'm a researcher, I'm excited about this. I can see how this method could be an area of research, and in particular in performative teaching, learning and research. And as I just mentioned, the job of the playwright is to position emotional triggers and leave behind questions in the mind of the audience. And as a teacher and as a facilitator, I very much see my students as an audience. And I believe that the best way I can teach them is by bringing them on an emotional journey that leaves questions with them, and hopefully that will last a lifetime if I teach them anyway good. So how this would work as a methodology, wouldn't you have to be a playwright to do this? Well, preferably yes, but if you can get hold of one, they're quite slippy. But at the moment I'm investigating my practice and seeing what is it about my particular way of working which can be separated into what is empirical, elusive, what is just particular about a playwright, and what is it that can be extracted, can be shared, useful and communicated with the bigger sphere. What I would see is that students would undertake a process that I would use in my professional theatre development. They choose a story, explore it through the drama and theatre activities and exercises, and present their findings to one another, which is pretty standard drama pedagogy. This would fulfil the teaching and learning element of what I'm proposing. One area would be to investigate how they experience learning in this way. So you could just research that. Usually, going from how do they transition from, say, referential modes of teaching and learning to performative modes, and just ask them that question. And you could use this method as a way of extracting information, or whatever way you want to do. So a further and more complex strategy would be to document the collective meaning of what's happening during the process and the presentation of the work. So any artistic kind of person working or researcher, and there's a lot of work happening in this, and especially in the areas of applied drama. But for me, what I want to really try and do is get to the presentation of the data, and that's the artistic aspect of the artistic research, the artistic approach to present these findings in the form of a play. For this, I think you would probably have to be coming from a black playwright background, and that's just from, I'm not saying I've done extensive research in this, but I have spoken to a lot of playwrights, and they do believe it's something that just comes rather than it's a kind of a learned, it's a natural thing you were born with, rather than being something that you're skilled up on. Although there is skills you can develop. Anyway, that's a different thing. So the point that I want to really consider is that if this method is successful, it's always going to be dependent on one unknown variable, which is the audience, which I think is really exciting. And I think this is where this kind of idea of protesting and testing new ways of thinking, and new ways of researching, and new ways of engaging together, is that the research isn't complete until you have the audience present, and that they're part of that research, that they are the ones going away with questions, they're the ones thinking about it, they're the ones breaking down those story patterns in their mind to unveil their own meaning and new meanings, and then they're talking about it, and I think that could be very, very strong. I think that could be a really good way of, and I suppose it depends on where on the learning curve you are in a particular way, but I think, for second and third years, that could be a really good way of working for them in literature, languages, digital arts, things like that. So, definition of yeah, I'm actually exactly there. So the question now is this new role, or if we look at, is this a new role? That's my other question. Or if we look to antiquity, has the playwright always had this function? So that's something that I'm also looking at, is the kind of more ancient role of the playwright in Greek theatre and that, and their kind of Socratic function, the whole collective consciousness, things like that. And is it just a matter of reconnecting with their critical and vital role in social and political action? That's not a question for another paper. And they're just some closing thoughts. Thank you.
political polarisation and water protests, austerity, resistance and changing values in Ireland. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. Hello, everybody. As Sandra said, I'm Niamh Hourigan. I'm in the sociology department here. I suppose in many ways I'm coming from a different side of the house because I'm a sociologist who works in social movements and values rather than a performer or somebody who works on performance per se. And I suppose just to set up the context of the material that I'm going to present today, between 2008 and 2013, I did a really large-scale ethnographic study which looked at, I suppose, the journey from boom to bust in Ireland through the banking crisis and then the bailout and then the austerity period. And essentially, I was really looking at the core theme in that on changing values in Ireland. And one of the things I was really interested in asking was, did ordinary Irish people, in their sense of what is good and what is bad, their kind of what we would call their everyday morality, the language of somebody like Andrew Sayre, had their attitudes to rules and relationships changed? Because both rules and relationships were problematized in the fallout from the banking crisis. We saw Sarah earlier talking about the Galway tent, and the Galway tent actually is one of the main spaces in which close relationships were problematized in a whole series of books after the banking crisis. But actually, if we look at the official reports, the other thing that was really problematized was weak rules. So I started to kind of dig down on, we had heard a lot about what essentially, I suppose, elites in Ireland had to say about this, and I was looking at, have ordinary Irish people's attitudes to rules and relationships changed? So that's the kind of outer layer of brush and all of this piece of research, and it was done in 3 tranches, and I actually finished the formal part of it in 2013, and I published a book earlier this year called Rule Breakers, and I'm kind of in recovery from that. So the second inner layer of the brush and all, my kind of post part and piece of this research was looking at protest, because prior to doing that, myself and Linda Connolly in our department had done a big book on social movements in Ireland, and I had done my own PhD on the Irish language movement. And people kept coming to asking me about protest in Ireland, both in the early stages when there didn't seem to be much protest, and then in the latter stages when protests started to kick off. So that's the core of what I'm going to be talking about today in terms of my ongoing research. One of the reasons I was anxious to present at this conference is that I'm developing a particular theme, which is kind of, I suppose, a sub-theme for me as a sociologist, which is about humour, because I've been particularly intrigued at the way in which humour has emerged within water protests. I was coming in this evening, actually, when I was coming in, somebody was talking to Sandra about getting their water bill, and I was kind of intrigued. I think it's very much in the air and in the water at the moment. So that is the very core part. That's the emerging theme, I suppose, within this research. So I suppose the first thing I'd like to say is that in the very early days of the bailout, which is kind of 2010 in particular, one of the big questions that came through from the international media when they were commenting about austerity and looking at how austerity was playing out in Ireland as it compared in particular to Greece, they were all saying, why is there no protest? And we see a whole, and this, how did it come to this? Nobody expected it to come to this. And we have people like Angela Merkel saying, look to, the Greeks should look to Ireland. They are the models of how to do austerity and how to respond to austerity. And we had, this is a piece, even from The Guardian in 2014, this is Seamus Power, David Nussbaum. And they say Ireland is famous for having a long history of occupation met with violent resistance. Many of its EU neighbours have seen large-scale anti-austerity protests over the past 5 years. In some countries, including Greece and Spain, these demonstrations have even turned into violence. Curiously, despite their past and the reaction of other closely related countries, the contemporary Irish response to imposed austerity has been peaceful. So the title of this particular piece was Not the Fighting Irish. And there's been a number of similar ones which have emerged. So the first thing I have to say actually is as a researcher of social movements, that's actually not true. That's not actually an accurate reflection if we start to map the story of protest in Ireland from not just the period of the bailout, but actually from the period of the banking guarantee, because we actually start to see a structural adjustment happen from that time. And there's in the research that's being done at the moment, there's a kind of emerging consensus that we can say that there's maybe 3 stages of kind of austerity protest in Ireland. The first actually is 2008-2009, and this is when, having given the banking guarantee, and the government was suspecting that they may actually have to honour this very luxurious blank cheque which they gave to the bankers, that there was a reining in of public spending in the wake of a period between 2007 and 2004, 2007, where public spending had been particularly lavish in its own way. So we see strong single issue protests from both students and particularly from old age pensioners, who are, I feel, a remarkably important and powerful and rather neglected group actually within the social movement literature here in Ireland, and indeed internationally. And we see a big protest, particularly in 2008. You had 15,000 pensioners, 10,000 students converging on Leinster House. That was a really sizable protest at the time. But as the reality that we might have to honour the banking guarantee started to dawn, you do see those protests start to mute and become subdued. And in Rule Breakers, and actually in some of the work I'm doing at the moment, I'm looking at the whole idea of whether there's a kind of post-colonial memory which linked to that kind of initial, what I would consider to be a freezing response to trauma. You know, I in my earlier work, I do work on trauma through work on feuding, and I often think that was very characteristic of a kind of freezing. But anyway, I'm still in the middle of that. So one of the things we see, though, even despite that freezing, there were small anti-austerity protests starting. We saw Occupy camps in many Irish cities emerging. Now, they were small. They didn't get anything like the public support that Occupy got, say, in the United States, but nevertheless, they were there. We also see emergence of an interesting, what I would consider almost like a ritual form of protest. This is the Ballyhay Says No campaign. Ballyhay is a small village on the North Cork-Limerick border, and they march every Sunday to protest against the paying off of bondholders. So it has this ritual dimension. It's powerful because they're doing it every week rather than because so many people are turning up. So in a sense, it is an important protest. But there are other reasons, I think, aside from the freezing, that why protests might have been relatively muted at this time. Gavin Titley and Julian Mackay both have done a lot of work on the media and how the Irish media covered the bailout. Now, there is obviously issues around the Irish media in terms of ownership, which I will get to later. But Gavin Titley in particular analyses the media discourse around the bailout, and he has the kind of 5 mantras, as he calls them, which number 1 is the country is broke, number 2 is we're all in this together, number 3 is we have to move on going forward, which I particularly like. Number 4 is the tough love of the IMF and the EU is actually good after a period of mismanagement, the we all partied line. And the Ur mantra, as he says, is there is no alternative. So this, and I think that actually, that idea that there is no alternative to austerity was a very powerful kind of muting or dampening factor on protest. Another reason which I think is important is that historically, Irish people, right back to the early 19th century, have a tradition of using the ballot box to express their anger. This is very from Daniel O'Connell's time. And we did see this in the general election of February 2011. The governing Fianna Fáil Green Coalition had the worst defeat of any Western European government since World War II, basically. It was really a drubbing. So therefore there was anger expressed in the ballot box. The final thing I think, if we look at that period, is that a lot of the key austerity measures, and one of which was the whole idea of water charges, didn't actually kick in until 2012. So in a sense, people weren't starting to feel some of the more negative sides of anti-austerity protest until 2012. Which brings us to our next period, which I think we can call popular mobilisation. And this was really started to crank up a bit with the introduction of the household charge. The household charge was an interim property tax brought in to kind of be a bridge. And in the Troika agreement, the memorandum of agreement, they were very hot on there being a property tax in Ireland and there being a water tax. They were also very hot on the fact that there should be reform of legal and medical fees, but fortunately nothing has been done about that, surprisingly. But anyway, so one of the things that was very clear with the household charge is that it was kind of it wasn't collected by the revenue commissioners, so it was very easy to evade. So one of the ways in which we see people expressing their unhappiness with the household charge is simply to not pay it, it's non-compliance. But that has now been changed in the property tax, which is collected by the revenue commissioners and therefore is much more problematic to evade. And most powerfully in 2013 we see Irish Water as an entity, a new utility, start to move into communities and install water meters. And one of the interesting things about community in Ireland, and I think it refers back to the title that Sandra talked about in this session, is that while I think historically the Catholic Church, which has so much power in Irish society, had a huge suspicion of national social movements who focused on society, because there was a whole series of potential challenges there to the order. One of the levels at which the Catholic Church actually promoted protest historically was at the level of community. So you see Mutiny, which was a community-based kind of organisation in the 1930s, very much having the support of the Catholic Church. And it's one of the interesting things that we see sociologically in Ireland, that community often trumps society. It's actually quite easy to get people to come out and mobilise to protest, to protect their communities. And it takes longer, it would appear, in Ireland. And again, that's something I kind of unpick a bit in the book. But certainly, Irish Water and the installation of water meters was a take-off issue. It had a galvanising effect on the anti-austerity movement, particularly when the Right to Water umbrella emerged. And we see 3 large-scale protests at the end of 2014. And we also see Paul Murphy being elected to the Dáil in the Dublin Southwest by-election. The government, in response to this, announced that there would be €100 relief on water bills, which didn't seem to actually mute the protests, because the next protest on the 1st of November, there was 100,000 protesters. But then the government suffered a very embarrassing defeat in the Dáil when Labour senators backed an opposition motion about whether Irish Water should remain in public ownership. So essentially, there was a kind of introduction of these flat rates then. And one could argue that there was a reduction in the mass levels of support from that period onwards. Though again, there was a big water protest in Dublin last Saturday, and this is an issue which is still in flux. Now, what we do see emerging at this point in time is a rearguard action from the government in terms of how they respond to water protests. And my colleagues in the University of Limerick, Martin Power, Owen Devereux and Amanda Haynes, have described this as the reasonable people versus sinister fringe discourse. And they date that from an interview that Minister Leo Varadkar gave on News Talk, where he described the water protesters and made a distinction between there's normal people and they're really sound and they're entitled to protest, but these people are thugs. So it was kind of an othering of a particularly vocal group within the water protesting kind of community. The term sinister fringe, and to a lesser extent sinister element, formed a significant part, they argue, of the state's discursive armoury in the battle for hearts and minds. Following Varadkar's initial use of the term, it was subsequently routinely used by the political elite in their attempts to fragment and undermine the legitimacy of protests. And Noel Coonan even upped this further subsequently by comparing the water protesters to ISIS, saying that they were acting like parasites and they wanted to live off country people. So no shortage of hyperbole from Noel Coonan TD. Now, there were subsequently 3 incidents which I would argue kind of ratcheted things up in terms of a polarising impact on the campaign. The first was that Taoiseach Joe Burton was trapped, or we now, as the state are now saying, falsely imprisoned in her car for 2 hours when she attended an event in Jonestown. Secondly, here in Cork, Gardaí had been called to a meeting of Cork County Council earlier this year because of the presence of water protesters, and there was also a protest outside Leinster House in July when TDs were unable to leave, and Minister Alan Shatter, who insisted on leaving and had to abandon his car subsequently, said, "I totally respect and recognise the right to protest and demonstrate, but this simply wasn't demonstrating. This is outright thuggery that violates a deputy's constitutional right to enter the House. It illustrates what type of politics these people represent, which is intolerant, anti-democratic and fascist." So essentially, we are seeing a polarising here, and a factor I think that comes into this, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, is the state's involvement and its association with Dennis O'Brien, who's a very wealthy and important businessman in Ireland, but also somebody who has a very clear vested interest in the water, in Irish waters charging, because his company SiteServe has been installing meters. Now, so putting back on my social movements hat, one of the things that I historically have looked at is what they actually achieve. In the early days, so analysis of social protest, people used to characterise, when you go back to the kind of early 1960s, people characterise protest as kind of, this is the resource of the irrational. People who can't use conventional politics, protest on the streets, they riot. We saw some of the re-emergence of these kind of views at the time of the London riots in 2012. But actually, since William Gamson's book in 1975, The Strategy of Social Protest, we have loads of evidence to suggest that actually protest can be a really effective way of achieving your goals if you do it in a specific manner. But there's three different levels in which I've been looking at the water protest to see what they've achieved. And the first level is policy. What actual changes have they made to policy? Now, they have generated some changes. There is this €100 grant that people will be getting, and they have flattened the rates. But there's no sense that the government are actually going to roll back on the plan to charge for water at all yet. Maybe after the next election that will change, but certainly that hasn't been achieved. The next level, and this again would be fairly standard in terms of assessing social movement achievements, is what has been the impact of water protests on the broader political milieu in Ireland. And I would argue that that's been really substantial. If we look at the European and local elections in 2014, we saw really marked gains for parties like AAA, People Before Profit, and Sinn Féin, who have maintained a consistent anti-austerity line and have been very vocal about the water issue. And then the final level, and I suppose it was the one that I was most interested in given all the previous work I've done on rule breakers, is values. Has the anti-austerity movement, has the water charges protest, has it actually had any impact on Irish people's values, their sense of what is the right thing to do in and every day? I'm not talking about religion or law here, but our general sense of kind of gut instinct about the right thing to do in particular situations. And I suppose this is where I started to link what was happening, and it's really just this year that this has emerged, where I started to link what was happening in the water movement to my work on rule breakers, which is about Irish attitudes to rules and relationships. And to be honest, this is a kind of long-standing theme in sociology. If we go back to the work of Max Weber and Emile Durkheim, and even if we look at Tony's in anthropology, you often see this tension between, well, I call it rules and relationships, but Tony calls it Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Durkheim calls it mechanical and organic solidarity, but there's this kind of a thread that runs along between them. So, are attitudes changing? This was why I was trying to map this big ethnographic study. I did 166 interviews, 9 focus groups. And one of the things that we did see is that there is undoubtedly an increasing critiquing or problematizing of attitudes to intimate relationships and cronyism. We saw that very clearly in Sarah's paper earlier on when she was talking about the Galway tent. We also see it in the penalty points controversy for those who are not from Ireland. Historically, we've had a practice in Ireland where people who speed or break the traffic rules get penalty points, but then people go to the local garage who's a neighbour and what we call, euphemistically called, squares the points, which basically means he makes them go away. And that practice, which had been fairly ubiquitous in Ireland, not just in elites, but amongst ordinary people as well, became highly problematized during the austerity period, resulting in the resignation of Martin Cameron, who was the Garda Commissioner, a change in the Minister for Justice, and a change in the Department of Justice as well. And even we saw the Fennelly report this week, so the fallout from that is ongoing. We also see a problematizing more of some rules. Particularly, it's been interesting to look at attitudes to tax avoidance. So we saw this particularly in the early austerity period. People like U2 who moved their financial affairs. And be clear, this is not tax evasion, this is tax avoidance. There was a criticism of that type of approach. But I feel that the point at which this kind of changing of values, which is quite subtle, has linked up with the anti-austerity movement is in the water campaign, and particularly since the revelations about IBRC and Dennis O'Brien. So for those again who are not from Ireland, IBRC was the bad bank which was set up after the bust to essentially hoover up all the bad debt of the Irish banks. And essentially, unlike normal people who have mortgages and who have to pay back essentially every cent that they owed, a lot of developers and very wealthy business people got large chunks of their debt written off, and we all paid for it. And it emerged, as a result of the persistent questioning of one particular TD, Catherine Murphy, it emerged that Dennis O'Brien would appear to have got, and again, this is all subject to a lot of legal proceedings at the moment, questions emerged about the deal that he got with the bad bank. And in particular, one of the things that fascinated me was that the core source of the controversy was a verbal agreement that O'Brien might have had with Mike Ainsley. And one of the things I really problematized in those was verbal agreements, and was this thing that the morality and the behaviours and the operation of intimacy often depends on this face-to-face stuff, rather than on, paperwork and rules and all the rest of it. And one of the things that we see actually is that the water campaign have really taken this one and run with it. That they have, if you see, I don't know if you've seen any of the protests recently, but there's lots of talk about Dennis the Menace, there's cries about him. And one of the things I'm particularly, and one of the things that's striking about it is that the government has been very silent about the IBRC and the controversy, strikingly silent. And there is, particularly if you look at the report of the Moriarty Tribunal, there is a historic relationship between Dennis O'Brien and particular Fine Gael. So one of the ways in which water protesters seem to have countered this silence is through the use of humour. Because as Schumacher, he writes about access responsiveness, which is basically when a social movement is being ignored by the state, what do they do? And of course humour is one of the ways to puncture that. Humour has been used, I think, extensively by the water protesters. So what use is humour in this context? And this is actually one from the early OAPs, which I thought was kind of fantastic. Humour is what I'm saying has always been part of the anti-austerity movement and always been used very effectively. But I think this year, and I particularly again think social media has come into its own, because all the headlines of social media, I sometimes hug myself because no one else will. Dennis O'Brien to sue everyone. We'd just like to say hello to Dennis, who's at home in Malta watching the RTE player on the proxy site. Hello Dennis, and this is hashtag Rose of Tralee, which is massive in the night. I was sued by Dennis O'Brien before it was cool. My personal favourite. Government discussed what to give Dennis O'Brien this time. Or somebody said to me yesterday, Dennis O'Brien and the way he might sue you. So there has been, I think, it is in a way, and what is really striking about this is that while O'Brien have been very effective at ignoring the mass street protests, these have hit a nerve. He's suing Waterford Whispers. He minds, which I think is the sense, if you're talking about access responsiveness, that's a response. So in a sense, humour has been successful where some of the street protests may be not so successful. But, and I finished that with this, there is a caveat, there is a danger, and the danger is that humour can backfire. Marginal Heart says humour is a highly complicated tool. The sense of humour varies strongly amongst classes, groups and times. In Western societies, the trait of having a sense of humour has only become widely accepted as a desirable norm since 1870s. As humour is strongly context-bound, the risk that a joke will not get through is high. In highly variegated societies, humour does not necessarily unite, it can also divide and exclude. And I just finished on one example where I think humour has backfired significantly for the water protests, and this was in late 2014, early 2015, when a water protester, Derek Byrne, footage emerged of him describing Michael T. Higgins as a midget parasite because he had signed the water legislation into law. There was a very negative public response to that particular intervention, and Byrne was issued an apology. Now it was a qualified apology, but nevertheless. And again, I think that particular intervention aided the government in its attempt to present the water protesters as the sinister fringe. So I suppose what I'm working towards or getting at the moment is the very delicate and tenuous nature of humour if you're using it, though nevertheless I think one which can be very powerful, particularly in the context that we're operating in Ireland at the moment.
Facebook updates, he just manages to capture little kind of mad little moments, you know, that are so funny but yet so real, and very humane as well.
Yes.
And not trying to sort of jab at anybody, but just like, look at us all, aren't we? You know, aren't we fools, or how are we letting them get away with it? You know, so there's a kind of a feel that, like, I think with the Dennis O'Brien stuff as well, with the Waterford Whispers, like, I thought when they published the letter that I didn't know how that would work with them. You know, because they put the Facebook, you know, when he sent the Sue letter, like, they put that up on Facebook, and I don't know that that served their cause, because then that made people feel, well, are you not taking that seriously? Because it is serious, you know, you're being sued. So,
One more, and then
Also relates to humor, and I have been working myself on humor in relation to children of the disappear, and I have drawing a little bit on Bergson and Freud and everything. But I thought, in which way, in your case, humor and the contagious power of humor in terms of effectiveness and the possibility of spread out and grow bigger could also be linked to water in terms of the materiality and the surface and this kind of possibility of flowing down.
For sure. And the other thing I actually think I'm interested in is, why are Irish people so annoyed about charging for water per se, when there's so many other things that we have? And I sometimes wonder, is it because it rains so much? Is it because we're surrounded by water so much that it's like more imposed water on us? So I think there are actually a lot of, and I have used in writing about this in the public domain, I wrote a piece for the Irish Times on it, and I use that metaphor of water. That is a very important point. I think we might be waiting till the end for further questions, and we'll take the next speaker, please. Please, Lisa Fitzpatrick. Okay, our next speaker is Lisa Fitzpatrick of the University of Ulster, and Lisa is going to talk about honour, gender and democratic community. This is kind of a grandiose title, and it's actually the beginnings of a project. So what I'm trying to do at the moment is to draw together a number of different strands, and one of the things I should probably say at the outset is that I'm not trying to draw equivalences between the way that honour operates in different cultures and different societies. Although it might sometimes seem, I know that because I'm sort of trying to cover a lot of information in a short space of time, it might kind of seem a bit all squashed together. One of my starting points for this was Sarah Ahmed's book, The Cultural Politics of Emotion, which considers the hierarchy of emotions and the attribution of emotional qualities and states to nations and communities as well as to individuals, to argue that claims about emotionality, whether of an individual or of a group, are clearly dependent on relations of power. And one of the things that she identifies in support of that is a discursive tendency in the West to understand emotions as a sign of, quote, how the primitive persists in the present, and is particularly associated with women and with the non-white other. So she considers the sociality of emotion, and that while emotions are presumed to be interior, they're actually social and cultural practices. And that emotion is not what comes from the individual body, but is what holds or binds the social body together. So when it comes to honour, one of the things that I'm making an assumption about there is that honour is closely related to the emotion of pride and also to shame. That it's experienced as emotion and that it's affective, and that it's performed in the public bearing of the individual as well as in his or her public words and actions. That it's most readily attributed to those in positions of power or authority and denied to those who are powerless or marginalised. Or there may be the assumption that the marginalised have no need of honour.
In the Western theatre tradition, the question of honour is thematically significant, at least until the late 19th century, and arguably still, for example, in the frequent adaptations, rewritings and productions of work like Miss Julie, which very much concerns the question of honour, and Hedda Gabler, which was staged very recently in the Abbey Theatre. So Ahmed devotes a chapter of the cultural politics of emotion to the affect of shame, and another to disgust. And both, I think, might be invoked in considering affective responses to the bodies of the dishonoured. Titling her chapter Shame Before Others, Ahmed notes the public nature of shame as distinct from guilt, which is a private emotion, that she says shame feels like an exposure, but it also involves an attempt to hide, a hiding that requires the subject to turn away from the other and towards itself. And she argues that shame manifests itself physically in, quote, the deforming and reforming of bodily and social spaces. She continues, in shame I feel myself to be bad, and hence to expel the badness, I have to expel myself from myself. In shame, the subject may have nowhere to turn. And this would seem to recall David's concept of objection, and Ahmed notes that in extreme cases shame can lead to suicide. In relation to sexuality, Ahmed notes that shame is often seen as crucial to moral development, and moral development is often bound up with, quote, the reproduction of social norms, in particular the norms of sexual conduct. Family love, she notes, may also be dependent to a greater or lesser extent on meeting those social norms. Disgust, which is performative, is likewise related to questions of shameful behaviour, or behaviour that's objected by the community. And furthermore, these are sticky affects. That is, shame and disgust tend to stick to their object and threaten those in contact with it or him or her. So both these affects seem relevant to the social or communal response to the failure of some subjects, especially female subjects, I think, to comply with social norms, and especially norms relating to sexuality. So some of the questions that I was looking at in this project is about when civil rights protect the individual who has transgressed against social norms, when are civil rights brought into question even when the individual has not acted against the law, and in what circumstances do civil rights fail to protect the individual. And I'm interested in the impact of civil conflict and times of national stress on questions of civil rights, and particularly women's civil rights. So some of the impetus for these kinds of questions has come from work in the Republic of Ireland on the Magdalen laundries, on the history of the Magdalen laundries. And that's been explored in a number of artworks, including Louise Lowe's site-specific performance Laundry, which is, I think, one of the best-known examples, which was staged in a laundry in Dublin in 2012, and Evelyn Lynn's art exhibition Breaking the Rule of Silence at the University of Limerick. So this relates to the history of the incarceration of women and girls without trial and without possibility of appeal through the justice system. And it seems to have been motivated by a sense that these citizens had betrayed the honour of their families and communities, and even of the nation itself. This is evident in some of the writing from the 1910s to 1920s, 1930s, in journals like the Irish Ecclesiastical Review, which publishes an ongoing debate amongst both lay people and clerics about what to do about unmarried mothers. It's also present in government debates and in newspaper opinion pieces of the times about the problem of unmarried mothers. And the women are often depicted in terms that suggest contagion. They're dangerous to the moral health and well-being of the nation. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting about honour and debates about honour wherever they are encountered is that they very often have to do with what is being said rather than what the individual has actually done. And this is something that comes up again in the recent reports in the United Kingdom on honour crimes. Those reports mainly focus on immigrant communities in the United Kingdom. But again, the concern within the communities about what is being said about the individual. So people are dishonoured through speech, more so than, very often more so than through their actions. In the 1996 documentary on Channel 4, Love in a Cold Climate, one of the women who's interviewed made what I think as a significant observation. So this woman was put into a Magdalen laundry after she had been sexually assaulted by her cousin. And what she says is, my cousin indecently assaulted me, and I told another cousin what happened, and the cousin reported the matter, and they got rid of me very quickly. The biggest sin in Ireland, well, apart from having a baby in them days before you were married, was to talk. You never let the neighbours know. And if they get rid of you, there's no talk, there's no scandal, the neighbours aren't sure. That was the safest bet. So that idea that the family, whatever happened, the family had to keep the secret, within its own boundaries, was one of the beginning points for this. And it's just a still from a New Productions laundry. The other kind of impetus for the research was some work that I've been doing on performance violence. And this is a Northern Irish production called Theatre of Witness. In 2010 they'd staged a performance called I Once Knew a Girl, which has 6 women talking about their experiences of the Troubles. And one of them, the dark-haired woman on the top, sitting on top of the block, is a former IRA commander in the Derry city area who talked about her experiences of sexual violence within the IRA and also her experience of domestic violence. And the quotes of the women, almost all of the women talked about experiences of sexual violence either as children or as adults. And what repeatedly came out in their testimony, this is sort of a witness type production, so it's women talking about their own experience rather than a staged script, is that they didn't speak about it, that it was important to keep it secret, that it didn't seem very important in the context of the wider Troubles. And also I think a sense that it was important not to talk about some of these questions because it called into, or it made problematic, the status of the men involved. So for the woman who was an active participant with the IRA, there was this sort of question of, well, if you were talking about community heroes, then you can't say that a community hero beats their spouse or abuses children. So in this sense, we have again this kind of question of honour. In the UK since the late 1990s and increasingly post-September 11, honour crimes have been a focus for reportage, documentary, fiction film, government and UN reports, and policy formation documents from various think tanks. Just within the United Kingdom, there's been changes in the law to provide additional protection to British citizens threatened with forced marriage abroad, and there are grassroots campaigns by organisations like Carmen Ivana and Southall Black Sisters against different forms of honour-based violence. A report, Crimes in the Community by James Brandon and Salam Hafez, sponsored by the Centre for Social Cohesion in 2010, reported extensively on the issue, and a SOAS-based research project led by Sarah Hussain and Lynn Welshman on honour crimes ran from 2002 to 2005. Panorama has produced a 2-part documentary, and there have been a number of fiction films, including Honour, released in 2014, and Catch Me Daddy, released earlier this year, and multiplying numbers of newspaper reports. And some of the texts, and especially the texts that are produced for mass audiences, reiterate stereotypes of Asian and Muslim women as lacking agency, and they commonly position white men and European institutions as the saviours of these women. So one of the things that I sort of aim to do with this research is to look at the way that this issue is being normatively presented as a problem of other communities, and to consider what the role of honour is and honour-related abuses in a European and post-Christian context as well, to, in that sense, sort of broaden the concept and to intervene into that debate, without saying that they are the same thing, but saying that, actually this is something that is much wider than something that can be attributed simply to marginalized communities. So the 2014 film Honor stars an Asian Muslim heroine whose agency is signalled by her unveiled hair, tight-fitting skirt suit, professional competency as an estate agent, and sexual relationship with an Asian man of another religion, a match her family will not approve. So when she is attacked by her murderous mother and older brother, she manages to escape, but her ultimate saviour is the white folk that her family hired to find and kill her. Despite his brutal past, he proves more affectionate and compassionate than her blood family. The film ends happily when he dies, but leaves her a large sum of money, the money that they paid him to find her, so that she can begin her new life in Scotland. So scholars from various disciplines who work on honour and honour crimes repeatedly draw attention to the way that these crimes are attributed to Muslim communities and immigrants from the global south, and British Asian communities within the United Kingdom. Although Brandon and Hafez refer to honour crimes being committed within the white British community as well, they don't identify any examples or discuss any forms of such violence. Instead, their report is entirely focused on customs and traditions attributed to other communities: forced marriage, honour-based domestic violence, whatever that is, honour killings, and female genital mutilation. Hossein and Welshman, Perna Sen, Aisha Parla, Upendra Baxi, and Dichle Koajoa, amongst others, variously assert, in opposition to this, that the structural and power implications are being ignored in favour of a process that blames immigrant or marginalised communities and their outdated and unmodern notions of custom and tradition. Koajoa writes that, quote, honour crimes stand at the intersection of multiple political and social dynamics, and that honour crimes and other so-called traditional practices should shift from a focus on tradition or culture to an examination of the effects of various institutional structures. And she offers a definition of honour crime as the murder of a woman by members of her family who do not approve of her sexual behaviour, which is regarded by some scholars as the paradigmatic example, but which is very much narrower than the definition that's used in the government and the UN reports. Writing of violence against women, Jacqueline Rose sees a continuum of misogynistic violence that crosses cultural and ethnic identities, though she draws a distinction between acts of violence committed for reasons of honour and other acts of murderous violence against women. In relation to gender and violence, in a statement that resonates with Koajoa, Rose says, quote, honour killing is the cruelest modern exemplar of how the sexuality of women can provoke a patriarchal anguish which knows no limits in the violent lengths it will go to assuage itself. But we kid ourselves if we think that human fear of sexuality, and then the hatred of women, which is so often its consequence, is something that the so-called reason of our modern world can simply and safely dissipate. The distinction between honour killing in the broad definition given by Brandon and Hafez and in the Western media, and misogynistic violence that seeks to control or punish female sexuality is not entirely clear in Rose's writing. I suspect that she's basing her distinction in part on the relative value placed on the individual and the community in different ethnic or faith groups, and positioning herself within Western culture as part of a dominant post-imperial secular culture, which tends to privilege the individual above the group or above the community. And honour, given that it is performative, requires the recognition of a community. It requires the other to recognise that you are an honourable person. Rose's reading of misogynistic forms of violence tends to focus on the private and domestic nature of many of these abuses rather than situating them within this broader structural framework that scholars like Koajoa call for. However, Koajoa's essay also identifies what she calls performance of honour, meaning that civil courts, she writes of Turkey, frequently take into account the woman's dress and sexual behaviour in deciding family law cases. And what she identifies here, I think, is surely very familiar to women in the West, to citizens in the West, in circumstances of crimes of sexual violence, where very often the honour of rape or domestic abuse victims is part of the trial and part of the test of the victim's credibility, even where the law officially deems such considerations irrelevant. So that hegemonic representations or understanding of performances of gender are important in the pursuit of these kinds of crimes. And if the victim doesn't fit within those stereotypes, then their chances of proving a case are, I think, much more difficult. Oh, okay. So, all right. So, what I have been planning to refer to, so I'll just jump ahead to that, is the court case in a few years ago in Kerry, in December 2009, when Danny Foley was found guilty of sexually assaulting a woman he'd met at a local nightclub. And what had interested me about that was that the man was found guilty prior to sentencing, and within the courtroom, about 50 local people who were described in the media as being mostly middle-aged men queued up to shake his hand before the sentencing as a gesture of support for him. So this took place in Listowel, and was picked up by News Talk Radio and reported quite widely. There were a number of blog postings on the topic, and it was a small media storm for a couple of days. The local priest, inevitably it seems, came on the radio. He had acted as a character witness at the trial. He said of the accused that he always struck me as having the height of respect for women. There's not an abusive bone in his body, and he was one who had queued up to shake the man's hand. And he described it as an alleged assault and a miscarriage of justice. So I used this as a kind of illustrative example. Part of the commentary from the bloggers was that this was about Kerry being backward and the sort of rural Ireland, and relating it to the work of John B. Keane and suggesting that it was this kind of situation which was closed to outsiders, suspicious of the law, and very misogynistic. But in fact, there are a number of recent cases where the same kind of response has been evident in social media, where women have made accusations against footballers or against other celebrities, and have met with the same kind of response. So Corinne Marderosian notes that somehow rape always comes to be grounded in the victim's behaviour or emotional dynamics rather than in the perpetrator's actions. And Susan Ehrlich comments, rape victims are constructed as victims when the perpetrator is heinous, and agents when the perpetrator is respectable, so that they occupy contradictory subject positions in line with the contradictions that imbue dominant notions of female and male sexuality and sexual violence. That I think that what was in operation in the case in Listowel and in other cases as well, which have been operated mainly through the social media, is that there's an underlying premise that there are two kinds of women. There are respectable women who have to be treated appropriately, and there are women who get drunk in nightclubs. And therefore, the sort of underlying premise of the men lining up in the courtroom to shake hands with the convicted man is that that if the woman had behaved within strict limitations, this kind of situation would never have occurred, and that Foley is, in a sense, becomes the victim of his victim. What I had, or what I'm attempting to do with the project is to open up this sort of question of honour and the way in which it impacts upon gendered behaviour and ideas of gender performance, and to look at it in a wider context than simply sort of containing it within immigrant communities on the one hand, and but rather situating that kind of violence within the spectrum. So thank you. I'm sorry that's probably a bit wrong.
I'm going to move into the break by a couple of minutes and ask our speakers if they would mind coming up again and see if there are any further questions or points for discussion. I know that there were hands up and that I didn't take a couple of questions. Glenys, did you have a question?
No, it wasn't a question at all. It was just the very last thing you said, Niamh, about why is the water protest, really got into people's minds and hearts. And I was just recollecting my local councillor, McGonagall, famous quote saying, let them drink rainwater. That was what she said. So, yeah. I mean, it is interesting why the water protest has...
There is something resonant,
which
definitely requires more exploration in terms of, I think, just even our physical environment and the role of water in it. And also, I suppose, the materiality of water and the way that sometimes, I suppose this is what one of the cases that I was making in Rule Breakers is that so many of our attitudes to rules, essentially, I think have elements of that post-colonial memory in it, where rules were made far away, they were inherently unfair anyway, and they were kind of remote, and you just had to get on with it. That kind of, but I suppose, and I think this is the case with the water meters, and to a lesser extent with the property tax, but particularly because it's material, because it's physically somebody digging up the footpath in front of my house. And because it's an element, that it is hitting, the materiality is hitting people at a different level, and I think that it comes back to this very powerful question in all the literature on social protest is, why grievance, like why do some issues promote grievance, or why, if we look at even work on the American Civil Rights Movement or indeed feminism, why do you have these periods of abeyance where people just put up and get on with it, even though they're aggrieved, and then why do you have this flashpoint and something starts to escalate? And in a sense, I don't think we know the answer to that yet because we're still in the middle of it, but it's fascinating to be trying
and
to
also it would be interesting to see what happens if Irish water does hit the dust. How are the people who've paid? I can see splits with people already. Little minor splits, but not pleasant,
No, I mean, for those who are not in the unfortunate position of not having to pay, less than 50% of people who were supposed to pay their first water bill paid it. I think it's something like this, 43% compliance. So that's fairly massive rule breaking. It's a majority, which again, I think, and given the fact then that half haven't done it, will even less people play the second one. So
I think there might be a couple of other questions as well, so I just might interrupt occasionally because we are very short on time for this.
Really fascinating panel, and I'll take the opportunity of being at GCC to get back directly to Jenny and me for questions, but I have questions for Lisa. I was really interested in your project and the ideas that you're going to develop, and I was wondering if you were going to keep it within Ireland or look beyond at other democracies, for example England, because what you were saying, I was speaking straight away of Veshti, dishonor, and I think that it really resonates in what you're looking at and the body of the woman, and now it is in opposition with tradition, and for the author as well to be submitted to a fatwa, and that oppression to writing actually resulting into the writing of another play. So.
I'm based in Northern Ireland, so the project at the moment is Ireland and the United Kingdom has been its focus, and then with a slightly future version of it, where I've been talking to some people in other Western European countries about maybe organising some workshops or a network, some kind of research network. But I did actually, Veshti was originally part of the paper, but I didn't really get to it.
a very quick question, and although I could speak to Jenny on Monday, I think it would be very interesting if she could just let the people in the room who are not from Ireland know the name of the author. On one of your slides, Jenny, there was a book, I think it's called Irish Flames.
Oh yeah, his
John
name is,
something.
he's an English writer, John Waller's his name.
John Mark, thank you. It's about 1920s Ireland, I think, isn't it?
Well, the book was written in 1930. Well, the book was written recently, but the original manuscript was written in 1930, and it was written by his brother Peter, who was retrospectively reflecting on his experience of the arrival of black and tans to Ireland as a 10-year-old child. So it's very much that kind of perspective.
Thank you.
So it's interesting.
We'll take just one more question, I think. Well, we'll take two then and sort of that, but could we keep the answers quite brief?
Sorry, I hope this isn't too kind of philosophical a question in one sense, but I would very much like to hear the views of all the members of the panel on, to what extent, and I appreciate it's a very general question, but to what extent as the law against protest of all forms, all forms of peaceful protest, and in the context in particular with regards to the water charges, but as the law tightens, to what extent is there a moral obligation to consider breaking the law?
Can I just, before you answer that, we take the second question as well, and then we can consider...
My question was to Lisa, which is more like a clarification question. If I understand it correctly, and can you elaborate a little bit more, if you were hinting at the hypocrisy in this, in Western democratic communities, always referring to honor killings in Turkey or, outside, it's like a very dark side of Orientalism and feeding Islamophobia, but actually not addressing, these other issues within their own communities.
Okay, shall I answer that?
Maybe if you'd like to answer that one, briefly, if you can.
I think I hadn't really formulated it as hypocrisy exactly, but Kojo talks in one of her papers, I think it's about within Turkey, a characterization of honor crimes as coming from Kurdish community. So within Turkey as well, it being kind of associated with marginalized communities or communities who are regarded as sort of less socially developed. So I think that there's a sort of a sense in which it's continuously displaced, and I think that another reason for that perhaps is that it allows governments to do nothing about it, because they can say it's culture, it's tradition, and therefore sometimes to refuse to try and really engage with the question, and that it becomes just dismissed as something that those kinds of people do. So I think within the West that happens, but I think also within other cultures.
Consider the other question then about the breaking of the law.
Sarah, you'd like to go first? I was thinking, I think it was really to what she said as well. I think there's a massive moral obligation to continue to break the law in those cases, because those laws are put in place to silence people's voices, and it has a lot to do with attitudes towards wills and relationships as well. Or that, and also to find more creative ways of protest, so that which sort of relates to what I say, so to kind of redefine what protest is and delight people in it. I think humour for me has a huge role too. But I think it's a mixture of both, to strategize and also to blatantly disobey that law, because that law is wrong, in my humble opinion.
I mean, if you look at just briefly on that, with Iceland as an example, 4 years ago they chucked out the IMF, put the bankers in jail, and 4 years later their economy is doing well. They've 330,000 people living in a social democracy where they so I think human organisation is changing. Trends of human organisation are changing to meet the needs, to look outside, to get into the cracks and then come up, so that's what I think in terms of protest. I think it's also an it's how people organise themselves, and I think it's changing a lot, and it's changing rapidly and radically all the time.
Did you want to
Yeah, I think first of all there is. I think it's very interesting to look at the way the policing and kind of monitoring of protests has changed, particularly with the water charges and the characterisation of what certain tactics are. And I mean, there's a long history within social protest of people deliberately breaking rules to draw the state on them. In my earlier work on the Irish language movement, there's this great case of this woman who refused to pay her television licence. She was a granny and mother of 10, and she did it to force the state to take her to court. And then she got up in court and gave this big long spiel about the Irish language and why it needed its own TV station. So, you know, breaking the law can be very useful. But I think if we look at from the work of William Gamson onwards, there is a point where if people start to if the state starts to change the law to make it very regimented, there's a case for taking different approaches that kind of get around the law. So we see in Irish nationalism historically, you know, they had this thing of outlawing particular newspapers and then they just close it down, start it up under another name. That creativity, I think, gets rewarded. But at a certain point, I think there's also a point where the effectiveness of the law breaking tails off, and then you do need a leadership strata or a group who can engage. And there's certainly a lot of evidence to support that too. So if it's all rule breaking, I think there comes a point where that runs out of ground.
Can I have one time that I read Right to Water have set up they've released a policy document, like a full party policy document called Right to Change. And I read through it yesterday, so they are formalising their protest, they are turning into policy.
I think we have actually run well into the break time, so I should probably bring this session to an end. It's been a fascinating session, and I think the discussion has been very helpful as well, and maybe people can continue discussing over coffee and teas. But I think we'll be,